another way of thinking about this might be to say everything on the right is outcomes research. Here's another sort of clip from the internet that talks about descriptive versus analytic studies, but their final distinction or division down at the bottom is observational versus experimental, where experimental is defined, and this is pretty consistent, experimental is defined as, well, actually, I shouldn't say this because here I can see what it's saying is that individuals are defined according to an assigned exposure. Now, the assigned exposure must be randomly assigned, right? For the, in the context of like a randomized controlled trial. But in epidemiology, they also want to be able to draw inferences from between group designs where individuals got some assigned exposure. For example, they were prescribed a medication, but that was not a random process. So I'm just making the point that this is not confusing for a reason, and we all apologize. I apologize on behalf of all the scientists. Here's just another way of thinking about it. It's, qualitative studies versus quantitative. And then here again, you'll see the quantitative is broken up into descriptive versus analytic. And then analytic is broken up into observation versus experiment. I'm going to come down on something myself at the end. I'm just trying to sort of show you that, it does definitely depend on who you are and how you think about what it is that you do. Here's yet another one. This is exploratory versus conclusive. That's not a horrible way to think about research design. Some design is purely exploratory, and it's not depicted in this slide, but it's possible that, it might say above exploratory and conclusive, there might be a larger distinction, right? Maybe that distinction is qualitative versus quantitative. Right, we don't know. And the point is nobody knows. There is no right answer to the question of how do you taxonomize or think about the different types of research designs that are out there. On to the next one. This is another, I think, important distinction to not lose sight of when you're thinking about the kinds of research designs that there are. And that is this issue of was the analytic approach conducted with new data, or was it conducted using existing data? That is an important distinction that should be thought about when we talk about the kinds of research designs that we're using. There is probably one of the bigger distinctions in the way people think about design is between the epidemiologists and everybody else. Epidemiology grew from observations of patterns of disease, and then hypotheses about causal mechanisms, and then ultimately hypotheses about cause, completely in the absence of experimental data. And so epidemiology has carried that tradition largely forward, and have developed a lot of really sophisticated models to talk about ways that studies could be designed on secondary or pre-existing data that would allow or strengthen the ability to draw some sort of a causal inference from that data. And so you can see that there's this issue of like, well, was it, were the people selected and then followed forward in time, or were they selected and then their records were looked at, right, looking back in time? We're going to try to differentiate all of this at the end. And then this is just one more epidemiologic way of thinking about research design. And this starts at the top with experiment versus observation. And then you can see on the left, the question is, if it was an experiment, was allocation random? So the epidemiologists, right, they're all about non-random exposures or non-random allocation to group, right? That group, people end up in the group they're in a non-random way. I'm going to come down on the side, you'll see when we get to the end, that nothing that is not randomly assigned should be called an experiment. But I think we're close to that slide now. So, I show all those slides and sort of make all of those points to say, I very often will just refuse to write a design statement, right? Unless, unless it's very, very, very clear and straightforward. And I often try to write my research design statement and embed it or couple it with also something that speaks to the tradition or discipline I'm from, and also perhaps the analytic approach that I'm going to take. So here's the final slide. So as I said, the caveat at the beginning is this is entirely my own thinking about this. But I think there are some fundamental dimensions of research design that it is worth, trying to think about, trying to learn, and when you're reading research, trying to think, along these dimensions. And I think those are, first, if the research is quantitative or qualitative. Those terms refer to entirely different epistemologic positions. And by that I mean, epistemology means how we learn about things. Epistemology is the Greek word that speaks to sort of not questions about the things themselves, but instead questions about how we come to learn about things. And qualitative and quantitative research are entirely different ways of coming to learn about things. And so I think that is a fundamental distinction. To the extent that you are doing quantitative research, the next distinction that I think is important to try to think about and memorize is, was it experimental or was it observational? These are still fuzzy terms, although we'll start with the easy one. An observational research study is one in which no attempt at all is being made to draw any kind of a causal inference, not even to hint at it, not even to sort of suggest that that might be the direction that the research is going. It's entirely either descriptive, right? Here's a sample of patients in my hospital, and here were their scores on the HCAHPS survey for the year 2023, right? Just a description of some data. It's possible that you might also want to say, in that same example, I have a sample of discharged hospital patients who took the patient's satisfaction measure, which is called the HCAHPS, about their hospital stay. And I might want to try to associate, let's say, diagnosis with scores on this HCAHPS measure. Am I saying anything about the diagnosis causes the patient's scores? No, I wouldn't want to. It wouldn't be appropriate. I probably wouldn't embed that in a research study. It just doesn't make sense to talk about that or think about that. Observational research is just that. Experimental research, and let me just say this, a randomized controlled trial is where participants are sampled from the population of interest and then randomly allocated to 2 or more groups. That is an experiment. Random allocation or random assignment defines experimental research. Everything that is not that, but that is also not observational, not strictly observational, is probably quasi-experimental research. Quasi-experimental research, defined by Shadish, Cook, and Campbell in their early writings and then later in the textbook, is defined as studies where attempts are made to strengthen the potential for a causal inference in the absence of randomization. That's what defines quasi-experimental. All study designs where some attempts are made having to do with the design of the study, the collection of confounding or covariate variables, possibly matching people between groups that are non-randomly assigned, right? All of these things that we might do, because what we're trying to do in some sense, right, is elevate our non-randomized groups to what they would, our non-randomized group study, elevate it in some sense so it looks as much as possible like it can a true randomized experiment. So I'll just say it one more time. Experimental studies involve random allocation of people to groups. Quasi-experimental studies involve non-randomized studies where there are attempts made to make the groups look as much as possible like they would had they been randomized. So generally, those are going to, if you think of yourself as an outcomes researcher, you want to know about the effects or outcomes of some interventions, then these are the study designs that are of interest to you, right? Because, outcomes are necessarily a causal phenomenon. Some treatment causes an outcome. And that's why that sort of bracket is over there. So the next distinction that I think is important is this issue of whether or not the data that you have on hand are, new to you. So what that means, prospective data collection means that you stand at a specific point in time, you conceive of a research question, and then you design a study, and then you go out and get the data. That's prospective research. Retrospective research is everything else. Pre-existing data, data from public sources, data from hospital records, data that your mentor had, and you asked them if you could, mine it for another study. It's pre-existing data. Even though your mentor may have collected the data prospectively, right? When you wrote about that, you would need to say, I conducted a retrospective analysis of pre-existing data. That's a retrospective study. Okay, the next distinction that I think is worthwhile calling a fundamental distinction is the issue of whether the research is cross-sectional or longitudinal. Cross-sectional research means that you interact with the research participants only once. You may ask people, so for example, in my work, I'm interested in adverse or traumatic experiences, which are necessarily things that happened in the past. I ask people, did these things happen to you in the past 5 years? And then I also ask them, what's your health status right now? Even though they're reporting on something right now and simultaneously reporting on something that happened in the past, I'm only interacting with them right now, right? I'm conducting a cross-sectional research study. Longitudinal research is any research that has multiple observations on the same people over time. Longitudinal research can be prospective or retrospective, right? I can design a prospective longitudinal study where my research design touches I touch them, I measure them 4 different times. I can also design a longitudinal retrospective study where I go into their medical record and I look at some outcome at T minus 1 year, minus 2 years, minus 3 years, and minus 4 years. So, right, that you can have either prospective or retrospective longitudinal research, and you can have either prospective or retrospective cross-sectional research. You also could have a longitudinal retrospective observational study, or you could have a longitudinal retrospective quasi-experimental study. Let me say that again. A longitudinal retrospective quasi-experimental study might be one in which I design a study. I'm going to mine the medical records in my health system. I'm going to get everyone who took drug A, and I'm going to get everyone who took drug B. And then for as many times as I can find their data in the medical record, I'm going to assess some outcome like, HbA1c, for example. I'm going to collect as many other variables as I can from their medical record because I want to try to control for other important things that I think might influence HbA1c, that is in addition to the treatment that they got that I'm interested in. And I'm going to do that because in my heart, I want to strengthen my study design, to support, something approaching a causal inference, right? In that case, I would have a longitudinal retrospective quasi-experimental study. Those, I think, are the really important ones. I do also have on this slide the notion of whether or not the data that you collect are survey/self-report data, or if you have objective or hard direct observation on objective outcomes like HbA1c. So I think if you think about these words, use them appropriately when you're tasked with sort of, what kind of study is it? Oh, these are really the only words you need to know. All of those other taxonomies and versions, they're just different ways of conceptualizing this space. And then for some reason, this slide doesn't have anything to the right of primary research, but primary research is to be contrasted with secondary research. Everything we've talked about here, so this is a little confusing, right? Primary research doesn't mean prospective research. primary research means whatever you're doing is in service of the question that you have, right? So you could have primary prospective, primary retrospective, but you're asking a research question and you're designing a study to answer the question. That's primary research. What is to be contrasted with that is synthesis, right? So if I'm going to aggregate a whole bunch of studies and I'm going to sort of do a qualitative analysis of them, or I'm going to do a systematic review or a meta-analysis, that is what is contrasted with primary research. Okay, so I think my takeaway slide, I'm going to skip these two, is that there are as many study designs as there are studies, right? And if you have been in class with me or listened to any of my other lectures, you've heard me say, we design the best study that we can, given many, many factors and variables at play. So it may be the case that your research question could yield itself to an RCT, and maybe you have enough money to do a small RCT, but it's not, the field is not far enough along to justify an RCT, right? It's just not, we don't know mechanistically, there haven't been enough animal studies, we're not sure about safety or tolerability, or it might be the case that the field really is there. There are mechanistic studies. We know safety and tolerability. It's time for, what the field as a whole needs at this point is a large RCT, but you can't afford that, right? So we're always constrained by all of these sort of competing things. Research design is, subtle and technical and complex field, a domain with a lot of considerations, but I think it's really what it comes down to is that the study that we end up doing is the study that we can afford that best fits the question at that time. Okay, well, I very much appreciate your time listening to this, and I hope you all are having a great day.